I like that Peta mentioned the education system in Iraq, because one of my memories is of students, or former students, because school is not in session, who laughed when I told them that in the United States, to go to school, you had to have a job and go to work, so you could support yourself to go to school. And they just thought that was the most backward, insane concept. Like, you mean you have to work to be able to go to school? You don't get paid to go to school? And to me, it was very jarring, because we were kind of indoctrinated with this idea that they were the ones who were backward. So it was kind of a very strange thing for me. But I wanted to start by saying that on the 9th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, which was this past March 19th, 2003, we held a vigil on the 20th in Los Angeles at the Westwood Federal Building to mark that day. But on the 9th anniversary, President Obama marked the anniversary by making that day an official holiday. That day, the invasion of Iraq is now called the National Day of Honor. In his declaration of this National Day of Honor, President Obama writes things like, American soldiers were fighting block by block to help the Iraqi people seize a chance for a better future. He said that American soldiers, quote, took new roles as diplomats and development experts to improve the communities where they served. Their strength toppled a tyrant, and their valor helped build opportunity in oppression's place. Across nearly 9 years of conflict, the glory of their service always shone through. The rest of the language in this declaration is gushing over the honor and heroism of U.S. service members and the righteousness of the mission. The bravery, the valor, the glory, the sacrifice, the success. This is how they are writing the history of the war. A just, heroic mission with unforeseen, evil resistance that was defeated by our soldiers' determination to serve the United States of America. This is the history that they want to write. And they want to write the history as this because the reality is that this government sent those soldiers to a war against the will of the majority of the people in the United States and in Iraq. The reality is that they lied, and we can say now with no question that they lied about why they were sending those soldiers. They ordered them to unleash the full might of the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen against a people who committed no crime nor posed any threat to us or our families. They gutted our schools, our communities, our healthcare and social services to pay for that war. They laid waste to a beautiful, proud country. And when the war wasn't going as they planned, they kept throwing bodies and more bodies and more bodies into the grinder. And in its wake, they left every single person who was touched by that war destroyed and abandoned with no help, while the vultures on Wall Street cashed in. That is the real history of the Iraq War. And what will, for the time being anyway, be etched onto our calendars in the United States as the National Day of Honor, it will be something very different for Iraq. It is a day they will remember forever as a day of fear, as a day of pain, as a day that marked the beginning of a new nightmare, one that would cost the lives of around 1.3 million people, that would leave 5 million homeless, 4 million orphaned, millions wounded. They'll remember it as a day when a foreign military invaded their soil in a war of aggression and would not leave, and remained for years to raid their homes, torture their parents and children, shred their identity, and patrol their streets. That day, March 19th, 2003, will forever be ingrained in the consciousness of the Iraqi people. Not as a day to honor the U.S. military, but as a day that they'll remember as the true face of imperialism. I was one of those soldiers who marched into Iraq on the eve of the invasion. I was 19 years old. I wanted to go. I was willing to die for my country, or whatever that means, as President Obama just honored me for. And at that time, I didn't know a lot of things. I didn't really know anything, but there's some key things that I really didn't know. I didn't know at that time that my commander-in-chief, my top military commanders, my top civilian advisors, when they were telling us that we had to go risk our lives, that they were lying, that they knew they were lying, that the claims of weapons of mass destruction, of Saddam Hussein's connections to the 9/11 attacks, of the Iraqi people wanting to be liberated by a US invasion were intentionally fabricated and repeated 1,000 times a day. And they lied because if they told the truth, it would be seen as so sinister they would not have been able to carry out their plans. On the eve of the invasion, I didn't know that we would not be greeted with flowers and people cheering in the streets. And I didn't know that for 10 years prior, innocent Iraqis were already dying on a regular basis at the hands of the US government, as it spent years bombing Iraq's food supplies, its power plants, its water treatment plants. I didn't know that they intentionally tried to starve Iraq, that they intentionally poisoned Iraq's water, that they intentionally designed medicine, that they intentionally caused the death of over 750,000 children under the age of 2 as a calculated strategy. I didn't know that I would be a part of such an unparalleled loss of innocent life, such an unmatched level of destruction, that it would constitute the greatest atrocity of the modern era. This is the real history of the Iraq War. They want the history of the Iraq War to be that of a relationship between US forces and the Iraqi people. That was one of mutual respect and cooperation, with just some rogue extremist elements and Al-Qaeda operatives making trouble because they hated freedom or something. Life under occupation tells a different story. From day one of the Iraq War, the rules of engagement for US forces were such that you could essentially kill anyone that you wanted and get away with it. And in a military inundated and indoctrinated with racism and chauvinism, that if soldiers or private mercenaries wanted to make Iraq their shooting range, they could do it. But it was beyond making an environment that allowed US forces to run wild. It was a matter of policy. Soldiers and Marines who have been to Iraq will tell you that they had orders to shoot anyone carrying a shovel or a cell phone. Some will tell you of a standard procedure of 360 degrees of fire, meaning any time a bomb went off, you would fire in all directions, including in civilian areas where civilians would no doubtedly be killed. Some will tell you of being ordered to, quote, out-terrorize the terrorists. I saw artillery barrages fired into villages in response to small mortar fire. I saw families come to us whose children were dead or who had their limbs blown off, begging for some monetary compensation because they were left with nothing. I saw literally thousands of prisoners come through a detention facility to be tortured and humiliated, who did absolutely nothing but be a military-age male who happened to live in a village that was picked at random to be raided. The daily violence, the daily abuse, the daily humiliation, all by an unwanted foreign invader, led to a widespread popular uprising against the occupation. The Iraqi people stood up. And no rank-and-file soldier who has been to Iraq can say that they don't understand why the people of Iraq stood up and fought back. In fact, that's a main factor why the majority of US troops ended up opposing the war, because it was clear that the people of Iraq who were resisting were justified in doing so. But the US government's plan and the popular rebellion that began to thwart it, they were prepared for that too. They used the tactics of divide and conquer. They formed Iraq's new government along ethnic and religious lines, which is in blatant violation of international law. They intentionally fostered divisions between different ethnicities. They armed different militias to fight each other. They staged bombings on civilian areas to frame one group against another. They intentionally took a country that had always been united, that had never identified as Sunni or Shia, and they shredded their national identity. That is the real history of the Iraq War. The so-called brilliant troop surge that brought the end of the war was nothing more than a combined strategy of extreme violence, unleashing all the firepower the U.S. military had on anyone who looked like they opposed the United States, and a strategy of deceit, where in fact they were paying tens of thousands, in fact over 100,000 resistance fighters, paying them to just take a break so that the U.S. military could give the appearance that it was winning the war. Well, who really did win the war? We know that the Obama administration essentially pleaded with the Iraqi government to extend the status of forces agreement past its deadline, to allow large numbers of troops to remain. But the mere threat of hundreds of thousands of resistance fighters pledging to return to full-scale armed struggle if the U.S. didn't leave forced the U.S. government to hedge their bets and withdraw scores of troops that they had hoped to leave as a permanent foothold, and scale down their presence to only the largest embassy that's ever existed on the planet, and the most fortified, guarded by hundreds of mercenaries and soldiers. But in reality, many of the military objectives that the Pentagon hoped to win were thwarted. Nor we can say that Washington succeeded in its mission of installing a puppet regime in Iraq. While the U.S. government definitely has its loyal clients comprising of Iraq's leading politicians in Iraq's parliament, the parliament also includes large sections controlled by tendencies hostile to U.S. domination. And this explains why some large oil contracts have gone to U.S. competitors, like China, which is something that a fully puppet government would not do. But if the U.S. failed to achieve many of its military and political aims, then who won the war?
Contractors.
Well, if you look at Iraq today, it would be impossible to say that the Iraqi people won anything. Their lives have been destroyed. Well, the bulk of Iraq's oil, once nationalized, now belongs to ExxonMobil. Shell was awarded huge contracts. Halliburton won drilling rights in large parts of the country and the lucrative contracts to rebuild what they had helped destroy. U.S. banks swooped in to seize control of Iraq's financial sector. These are the winners of the Iraq War. The main target of that war was control of Iraq's oil. Iraq was placed on the U.S. terrorism list the day that they nationalized their oil and had been targeted for regime change ever since. There were definitely winners in the Iraq War. It's the oil tycoons, the Wall Street executives who pat us on the back, who said we were all one nation, and then sent us to die for a lie. A small group of people are now much, much richer off the blood and tears of countless families. In the capacity that the Iraq War was a war for profit, then mission accomplished. And this exposes something very significant. What does it mean that we went to war for profit? It means that those who stood to make a profit, some tiny parasitic clique of billionaires, essentially own and control all the institutions of our society.
Yes.
Our elected officials who near unanimously supported the war despite widespread opposition, the military command who eagerly offered its services, the courts which deemed the atrocity legal, the media which propagated lie after lie dutifully without a shred of objective criticism. They used the police to spy on and infiltrate and disrupt those who were doing anti-war organizing. All of this puts on full display the true nature of the espousers of the idea that this is our country or one nation or a great democracy. But we must point out that super profits for the billionaires who sit atop society is not the sole purpose for the Iraq War. In fact, boiling that war down to simply private profit in Iraq is really it's a reductionist view. The war in Iraq was not just about profits to be made by gobbling up Iraq's oil and financial sector and the reconstruction contracts. It wasn't just about Iraq's resources, but global resources. It was about U.S. imperialism canceling the oil concessions that Iraq gave to Russia and to imperialist France. It was about gaining a stake for big business to compete with China. It was about control of the entire Middle East and South Asia, one of the last bastions of opposition to U.S. hegemony. It was about smashing any semblance of independence from Wall Street. It was about having a new foothold to threaten and intimidate and control the resource-rich, independent countries near Iraq, to be a bloody example to all governments who dare to oppose the will of Washington. We must understand that the Iraq War is a war for empire. We must understand it as inseparable from U.S. policy towards any other country. We must understand it as a coordinated regional strategy. We must understand the brazen crime against Iraq is as part of the same plan of building a so-called new Middle East for Wall Street, and that dictates U.S. policy towards Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Pakistan, Palestine, Libya, all of Africa. That is, nobody can claim to have learned the lessons of Iraq if they fail to defend other independent countries, regardless of the nature of their government, for the same plans of regime change by the U.S. empire. And that is what also shows us that this war is not simply an indictment of the Bush administration. It's not simply an indictment of the oil tycoons, the defense contractors, or the Wall Street fat cats who let us there. Of course, they should all go to jail. But the Iraq War is an indictment of the system at its core. It's an indictment of the system of capitalism. The system that inevitably creates a class of billionaire vultures who are able to control our society. The system that is compelled by its nature to seek out new sources of raw materials and super profits. The system that inevitably leads to wars of conquest for the enrichment of the few at the expense of the majority. This is the real history of the Iraq War. The American empire on the march against every last corner of the earth, not bowing down to its command. In its wake, it's left the country completely destroyed. It is difficult to overstate the level of suffering and destruction the Iraqi people now live with. Besides the number of dead, many Iraqis still have no access to electricity or clean water. Any level of political repression that the Iraqi people experienced under Saddam has been increased tenfold. It's left behind a chemical fallout that causes so many horrific birth defects that people have been told to stop having children, that the area has been deemed a fallout worse than Hiroshima. And anyone believing the lie that the war has somehow, out of care for the Iraqi people, one just has to look at the war's wake within the U.S. military to see how much this government cares about its own soldiers, let alone Iraqis. Today, the wake of the Iraq war in the U.S. military has led to an epidemic of suicides. Thousands begging for help have been abandoned, left to die alone with the guilt and trauma of what they had been sent to do. Hundreds of thousands of families thrown into chaos by loved ones they could no longer recognize. Suicides and suicide attempts are at such a staggering, record-breaking rate that can only be called an emergency situation, a complete crisis that this government has refused to respond to in any meaningful way. And it will always be written into the history of the Iraq War that during this time, the U.S. government allowed a wave of preventable suicides to sweep through its military, and not only did nothing to prevent it, but in fact actively prevented soldiers from receiving help, therapy, and compensation to save precious tax dollars. This is the real history of the Iraq War. And of course, if we can witness here the devastating effects of the war on U.S. troops, one can only begin to imagine the level of psychological trauma experienced by Iraq's entire population, who didn't do tours, but lived every day for 20 years of bombings and sanctions and 9 years of occupation. None will bear the scars of war deeper than the Iraqi people. And this history is still being written. Iraq is a country of proud, strong, heroic people. Iraq will rise from the ashes, and the US policy of denying Iraq any independence from the grip of imperialism will remain firmly in place. So there will be another chapter. But what we want to do today is not just tell the real history of the Iraq War, but present a way to truly commemorate and honor the millions whose lives have been destroyed, the thousands whose lives were thrown away. To do that, we must let the real history of the Iraq War become a tool to expose the system. We must let its lessons guide us to fight the system. We must let the horror stories be a catalyst of resistance against the system. We must link the suffering and the hardship of the Iraqi people at the hands of the US government to the suffering and hardship of our people at the hands of the US government. To show that their struggle is our struggle, that we have a common enemy, that we have common interests. We must let the real history of the Iraq War destroy the great lie that there is such thing as American interests, and that there is such thing as being one nation. Because the Iraq War exposes that there are two distinct sets of interests in this country that are diametrically opposed to one another. The interests of the banks, of Wall Street, of the 1%, and the interests of the majority, of those of us who spend our lives working hard to feed our families, those of us who want to go to school, those of us who want to live in peace, those of us who constitute the 99%. Our interests are nowhere close to the interests of those who sent us to war, and they are absolutely in line with the interests of the 99% abroad. So let's let the history of the Iraq War and its lessons fuel our anger, our determination, our resolve to winning justice for the war's victims, punishing the criminals who sent us there, thwarting their plans for empire in the entire region, and knocking down the entire criminal system altogether.